So welcome to the Critical Antiquities Workshop today. It's great to have you all here. I want to begin with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land on which we meet at the University of Sydney. The traditional custodians are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We want to pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I also want to quickly talk about the Critical Antiquities Network and introduce it for the uninitiated. So the Critical Antiquities Network was established in 2020 by Ben Brown and I, Tristan Bradshaw, in classics and ancient history at the University of Sydney, to bring together people working between diverse ancient traditions on the one hand and contemporary critical theories broadly understood on the other. So for Ben and I, what is a critical antiquities? Well, it involves grasping our relationship to antiquity as a standpoint of critique. To see the ancient past as a standpoint means we rigorously seek to understand its languages, cultures, institutions, or in a word, its forms of life. And we do this with a view to grasping its particularity. But as a result of this, we also, by point of difference, grasp the particularity of our own present situation. And as we come to recognise the deleterious aspects of our present lives through our engagement with the ancient past, we can also use antiquity to disclose alternative forms of life in the present. But I think this notion of standpoint is relatively familiar to those who work with critical approaches to antiquity, especially those influenced by the work of Friedrich Nietzsche. But for Ben and I, the point is to go further than treating antiquity as a standpoint, and to treat it as an object of critique too. That is, we resist the temptation and tendency to romanticize the ancient world as simply a refuge, which is how Brooke Holmes has described certain approaches to antiquity, and rather recognize that ancient societies are also worthy of critique. This results in accepting the present as a standpoint of critique, but not simply. It's through the dialectic we travel between antiquity and modernity that something else is produced, a symptom, perhaps, to use another of Brooke's terms that has also been put to great use by Emanuela Bianchi. And this something else, which is other than the past or the present, is the standpoint that we seek to disclose. For Ben and I, Karl Marx has been important for approaching antiquities in this way, but I recently read Brooke's article on bios for the online journal Political Concepts, and I found it to be such a thrilling companion for thinking and practicing a critical antiquities approach. Indeed, I feel like it is a work against which I will unfavourably compare all my future efforts to work in the vein of critical antiquities. Because there, Brooke treats the concept of bios with incredible sensitivity to the standpoints we occupy when approaching this now central concept in contemporary thought. Not content to simply reproach bios in contemporary thought with the philologist's or historian's contempt, Brooke stubbornly resists treating ancient bios as a refuge from the present, but is rather attuned to the fact that the standpoint we seek is neither in the past nor the present, but is an emergent product of the processes through which we engage both at the same time. And I expect we are going to be treated to a similar tour de force today, so let me hand it over to Ben to introduce our distinguished guest.
I'll keep the introduction fairly short, as Brooke is no doubt well known to many of you. Brooke Holmes is the Robert F. Goheen Professor in the Humanities at Princeton, and Brooke's work is extraordinarily wide-ranging, working on the Greco-Roman roots of Western ideas about the physical body, the natural world, matter, the history of science, and especially the way that intersects contemporary concepts of subjectivity, self, ethics, politics, the body, and so forth. And it is an enviable range that you have, Brooke. Brooke's first book, which has become seminal and widely recognised, The Symptom and the Subject, The Emergence of the Physical Body in Ancient Greece, published in 2010, was followed by a wonderful and very helpful volume on gender, antiquity and its legacy in 2012, and then an extraordinarily very interesting range of co-edited books and articles have followed steadily ever since. Brooke is rightly recognised as an international authority in all of these fields. And it's a great pleasure for us to be able to host her at the Critical Antiquities Workshop. And today she's going to talk to us on the subject of Canguilhem and the Greeks, vitalism between history and philosophy. Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you so much, Ben, for that generous introduction. Thank you, Tristan, for that wonderful exposition of the kind of community and collective of thinkers you're building here. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. And it made me very happy to think we're all here traveling this path together, diasporically scattered around the globe, but thanks to Zoom, here we are. And so I know it's late for people in the US, and certainly in the UK, and so I hope this is, but the Australians will be very, bright and hopefully will come in if we're all flagging at some point. So thanks for being here. So let's see, I do have a very minimalist PowerPoint, but I'm going to put that up. Let's see. All right. People can see that? Yeah, cool. Okay, so the Greeks haunt life as an object of historical and philosophical inquiry. The academic field of biology, a science, a logos of life by bios, has been around for a little more than 2 centuries. But the prefix bio has been proliferating in continental philosophy, critical theory, and political theory since the turn of the millennium under the auspices of biopolitics. Now, biopolitics is not synonymous with a history or philosophy of biology, even less so with the cluster of philosophical positions on life associated with vitalism. Yet the intensification of theoretical concern with life as an object of political, economic, and social control over the past few decades and over the past year has produced a series of dominant narratives about the history of life as a concept deployed with material effects in networks of power. Within these narratives, both historiographical and philosophical, the Greeks tend to be positioned in one of 2 ways. And here I'll draw a bit from the bios piece. The first strategy consigns the Greeks to obsolescence in the face of modernity's appropriation of life as an object of scientific and medical knowledge and state management. So Michel Foucault famously declared in 1966, in the order of things, that life as an object of knowledge does not exist prior to the 19th century. Only rather, quote, living beings which were viewed through a grid of knowledge constituted by natural history. Even more important to the periodization of life for biopolitical theory has been Foucault's claim in the final section of the first volume of the History of Sexuality, published in 1978, that a society's, quote, threshold of modernity has been reached when the life of the species is wagered on its own political strategies. For millennia, Foucault continues, man remained what he was for Aristotle, a living animal with the additional capacity for a political existence. Modern man is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question. Foucault himself marked the form of power emergent on the threshold of modernity with the neologism biopower, a term that's now been largely superseded by biopolitics. Biopolitics is thus, on this version of a Foucauldian line, essentially modern. And biopolitics, in turn, defines modernity. Now, the historicity of life in relationship to the Greeks and Foucault is complicated by his late work on bios, which I won't talk about here. But it's not only Foucault's work, of course, that's kept Greek life alive in biopolitical theory for the past 2 decades. Perhaps even more consequential has been Giorgio Agamben's ubiquitous claim that ancient Greek life is divided at its core into bios and zoe. In his 1995 Homo Sacer, bios defines life in the robust sense of the life lived by the proper political subject. It falls to zoe to designate what he calls natural or bare life. Far from lying outside of politics, zoe marks a state of exception within the political, where life is wholly vulnerable to the power of the sovereign. So Agamben thus uses bios and zoe to establish politics as, quote, the truly fundamental structure of Western metaphysics, insofar as it occupies the threshold on which the relation between the living being and the logos is realized, end quote. Agamben thus invests the semantic split, or alleged semantic split, in Greek life with far-reaching structural conceptual implications for metaphysics and politics in quote-unquote the West. And in so doing, he enacts another familiar way of conjugating the Greeks with life. There they are at the origins of the West and the foundation of man, capital M. So here then are the dominant choices on offer for the relationship of the Greeks and life. Either Greek life is obsolescent, or it survives ghostly but powerful. Either modernity should be read in terms of autogenesis, or we should tell an ancient origin story. Now, from one perspective, I find the choice easy enough. I do think the ancient Greeks matter to how we historicize life, and more specifically, I think that the history of concepts of life, nature, and the body elaborated in Greek texts produces, over the course of multiple readings in multiple reception communities not limited to Western Europe or modernity, philosophically interesting puzzles that we are still grappling with. Yet from another perspective, this choice commits us all too easily to an origin story that brings with it problems bound up in the entwined histories of modern vitalism, Philhellenism, and European theories of race in the 19th and 20th centuries. Donna B. Jones has shown how constitutive racialism is of philosophies of life in this period. Alexander Wahalia has critiqued the dominant biopolitical theories for misconstruing, quote, how profoundly race and racism shape the modern idea of the human, in large part by ignoring critical Black feminist thought. And I should say, I didn't put together a bibliography, but just email me if you want follow-ups on any of these citations. Martin Bernal's arguments about the formation of modern classics in the crucible of European racism and Black Athena are newly urgent. I think, however, there's still more work to do in understanding where Philhellenism and vitalism meet in claims to European or Western hegemony and universal humanism, so that we can think more critically with both, quote, the Greeks and the concepts of life in which they are entangled. And so I hope that this paper makes a small contribution to this project. With Sarah Brill and others, I reject Agamben's account of Bios and Zoe on philological and philosophical grounds. But critiquing Agamben can't just be a question of correcting an error. For doing so would leave intact the move Agamben makes, namely the plotting of bare life and Zoe at the primal scene of Aristotle's politics as a performance of linguistic and hermeneutic expertise that claims for itself the petrifying authority of the classical. For Agamben's philology, in the spirit of Heidegger, traffics in a claim to revealed truth that produces the totalizing reification of the Western tradition. So as a historian and as a philosopher and a Hellenist, I hope for something more than ancestral, mystified Greeks and self-generated moderns. But the challenge is that history at this scale, designed to answer to the present, is always philosophical and mythical, I think. And this is one reason why the Greeks don't go away. It's not the only reason, though, and here the historian in me pops up. For the history in what in standard academic terms is called science, medicine, and philosophy unfolds for millennia along axes of reading and rereading ancient Greek texts. These texts are recursively, materially embedded in radically diasporic multitudes of thought that, as I've already emphasized, cannot be described as Western European or white. And this multiplicity is another reason why the Greeks don't go away. The challenge that I've just outlined of history and philosophy is especially acute when the question concerns life as an object of philosophical and scientific knowledge within historical time. And among the most challenging, exciting, and problematic 20th century engagements with this question is the vitalism of the historian and philosopher of science, Georges Canguilhem. For Canguilhem, vitalism just is the blurred zone of passage between history and philosophy, or philosophy and history. In this paper, I want to demonstrate that this passage is facilitated by the Greeks in ways that haven't been fully articulated or critically examined in Canguilhem. I'll pursue this claim here through a close reading of the role of the Greeks in Canguilhem's influential and difficult essay, Aspects of Vitalism. The essay was first presented as one of 3 lectures at the Collège Philosophique in Paris in 1946 to 1947, and then published in 1952 in Canguilhem's second book, The Knowledge of Life. Although the role that the Greeks play for Canguilhem across his writings is more complex than what I can show for aspects of vitalism, the essay is important insofar it's the only one that Canguilhem specifically devotes to vitalism. Moreover, the essay's complicated staging of the Greeks, or I should say to his philosophy of vitalism. Moreover, the essay's complicated staging of the Greeks at the intersection of philosophy, history, and myth sheds considerable light on why antiquity might matter to Canguilhem's larger vitalist project. So pressing Canguilhem's use of the Greeks in aspects of vitalism thus brings to the surface difficult but persistent questions about the science of life as a privileged expression of human nature, on the one hand, or a series of culturally located but also complicatedly trans-historical practices of knowledge bound up in the transmission of Greek medicine, science, and philosophy. I hope that this reading will also raise questions about the origins of these practices of knowledge and their transmission to a we in the present, as well as to the conceptualization of race as both an object of scientific knowledge and the source of what eludes such knowledge and control, and finally, the temporality of biopolitics. So in closing, I'm going to suggest that by critically interrogating the way in which the Greeks mediate between history and philosophy for Canguilhem as the first vitalist, we can get clearer about what is at stake in the stories we choose to tell about life as an object of philosophy across historical time. And doing so, I hope, will help us craft those stories more critically and constructively. So born in France in 1904, Canguilhem was educated as a philosopher, historian of science, and a physician. In 1955, he took over from Gaston Bachelard as director of the Institut d'Histoire des Sciences et Techniques at the Sorbonne, which he led for over 15 years, in addition to supervising the examination and training for philosophy. For both institutional and intellectual reasons, Canguilhem exercised a formative impact on a number of post-war French philosophers, including Louis Althusser, Jacques Lacan, Pierre Bourdieu, Jacques Derrida, Etienne Balibar, and Gilles Deleuze. But his relationship with Michel Foucault was especially important. Now, in his definitive essay on Canguilhem's legacy, Foucault identified the marking of discontinuities as critical to Canguilhem's method in the history of science. Obviously, Foucault's probably influenced by his own method, but it's true of Canguilhem as well. Canguilhem's views on method were themselves shaped by Bachelard's historical epistemology. So Bachelard says science is proceeding along a path that's pitted with epistemological obstacles to be surmounted. And these obstacles decisively fragment time's continuum. This is how they create a history of science. In his fidelity to Bachelard's method, Canguilhem was unsparing in his criticism of historians of science who spent their time looking for precursors. The precursor is someone who ostensibly begins a project that's only finished at a later moment in history, at which point genuine progress is achieved. The precursor, Canguilhem argued in a 1968 essay, is a false object of the history of science. In fact, it endangers its status as history. For in making someone a precursor, the historian cuts them off from the very conditions, social, cultural, intellectual, material that determine their horizon of possibility. Time is taken as empty space that can be traversed first one way and then another. In the essay, the paradigmatic examples, this is in the 1968 essay, I should say, the paradigmatic examples of the precursor virus are the ancient Greeks, Aristarchus and Hippocrates. We smile, Canguilhem says, at those who invoke them to explain Copernicus or Harvey, so we know better as historians. In insisting on the irreversibility of history, Canguilhem echoes the most important tenet of his best-known work, The Normal and the Pathological. All organisms, he argues there, follow a path of irreversible development that is coextensive with life itself. Health is always a dynamic state, changing in relationship to disease and individuated by the organism's unique contingent passage through time and in relationship to what Canguilhem calls its milieu. The relationship between the life of the organism and the historical path of science is not merely one of analogy for Canguilhem. The discontinuities within the sciences or the history of science express what Canguilhem sees as a fundamental axiom about life. Life has a creative relationship to error, which is itself a product of the organism's ongoing interactions with its environment. Canguilhem's understanding of the relationship between knowledge and life thus frames his understanding of the endless but irreversible auto-correction process of the sciences, the history in science. On this understanding, knowledge isn't opposed to life, it's a fundamental aspect of life in its milieu. The transhistorical collective of scientists performs a continuous testing of life as an object of knowledge in a process necessarily marked by discontinuities, ruptures, and shifts because it involves living beings. So the knowledge of life is first knowledge that is made by life, and so belongs to it as the knowing subject, but it's also knowledge of life insofar as life is understood as an object of knowledge. So Canguilhem's approach to the history of the life sciences is shaped by his understanding of this relationship between knowledge and life. But here we arrive at a paradox. On the one hand, Canguilhem insists on the discontinuity within the history of science. It's because time is fragmented that the history of science is discontinuous. On the other hand, by understanding the knowledge of life as not only the knowledge that life gains, that life science, gains of life, but also the knowledge that belongs to life, we seem to have moved beyond the boundaries of history, precisely because discontinuity is now being read through a theory of life itself. In light of the problem, it's tempting to differentiate formally between the orientation of the philosopher on the one hand and the work of the historian as two distinct modes of inquiry. But Canguilhem insisted that he was doing both together, what he called epistemological history. History and philosophy are stubbornly implicated in one another for him. And this knotting of the two can be seen most clearly at the dense core of Canguilhem's philosophical commitment on which his claims about knowledge and life are founded, namely his vitalism. So Canguilhem makes it clear at the start of the essay aspects of vitalism that vitalism attracts him as a philosophical position. He argues that vitalism differs from other objects that a historian of science might take up, such as phlogiston or geocentrism. Unlike those erstwhile scientific objects and theories, vitalism can never be overcome. Rather, vitalism is, Canguilhem argues, quote, a certain orientation of biological thought, one that will be seen to have a significance greater than just that of a stage in biology's development. Its timeless counterpart is mechanism, as we'll see further. So if vitalism resists all attempts to disprove it, it's because it's not something that can be disproven. That's the philosophical part. Yet Canguilhem still inscribes vitalism within history and in two important ways. First, vitalism is a label that's been claimed by or applied to particular thinkers in the history of the life sciences and medicine, such as the 17th century Belgian chemical physician Jean-Baptiste von Helmont, or the 20th century theorist of organic holism, Kurt Goldstein. It's true that the meaning of vitalism in a historical context for Canguilhem is constrained by its limited historical resonance, its context. But the very recurrence of vitalism as a trans-historical phenomenon points to something crucial about its larger meaning. The second way vitalism is inscribed in history is that it has a beginning. It's only within a science of life as a historically embedded realm of activity with an origin that vitalism makes sense to Canguilhem. It's at this point in the essay that Canguilhem introduces the ancient Greeks. They surface as the critical point of passage where man's natural tendency, qua living being, to produce knowledge of life, produces life as a formal scientific object of knowledge. Aristotle occupies a crucial place here, but so does Hippocrates. The importance of the Greeks does not mean that Canguilhem neglects the boundary of modernity, far from it. Modernity separates a history of the philosophy of the living from a history of biology proper. Yet because vitalism recurs within the history of the life sciences across this field of discontinuities, it points to the entanglement of the philosophy of life within the time-bound construction of the life sciences. This entanglement points to the trans-historical persistence of the Greeks, blurring any strict boundary between antiquity and modernity. The final sentence of aspects of vitalism reads, "In the end, to do justice to vitalism is simply to give life back to it." Canguilhem implies that the work of the historian who thinks vitalism in time is instrumental to making this gift. But what kind of historical time do the Greeks in fact occupy? What does it mean to historicize, an act that we usually associate with contingency and denaturalization, an orientation toward life that Canguilhem describes as the expression of the confidence the living being has in life? So to answer this question, Canguilhem isolates out three aspects of vitalism. First, vitality, second, fecundity, and third, honesty. And each of these aspects offers a different perspective, not only on vitalism, but also on antiquity, Greek antiquity, whose recurrence throughout the essay in a discontinuous yet insistent fashion seems to perform its own vitality. So let's look at each of these three aspects in detail. As I said, I have a very minimalist PowerPoint here. So Canguilhem begins by setting aside the question of whether vitalism is scientifically true, and instead he asserts that it's true historically. The fact that it just keeps making comebacks is its vitality, the first aspect he discusses. But precisely because it eludes any one historical period, vitalism's vitality turns out to be a problem for the philosopher rather than the historian. But this doesn't mean that we're talking about an expanse of time coextensive with life itself. Rather, we're talking about the beginnings of a history, the history of biological theory, which Canguilhem says reveals itself to be a thinking that throughout its history has been divided and oscillating. This oscillation expresses a dialectical process that life produces in thought once it's emerged as an object of a science of life. So what this means is that the life at stake in vitalism is always already defined as a science of life. And as Canguilhem makes immediately clear, the science of life in an expansive sense, not biology per se, is given as Greek. It's, for example, the Hippocratic expression of trust in vis medicatrix naturae, which is the idea nature produces its own healing power, or its Platonist, Aristotelian, Galenic views on universal sympathy. Yet from another perspective, the life expressed in Greek vitalism precedes it. For vitalism turns out to express a more basic, instinctual distrust of the power of technology, technique over life. In other words, vitalism translates something internal to life itself, which we've seen described by Canguilhem as the expression of the confidence the living being has in life. Now, this confidence is shaped by life's fundamentally agonistic relationship to its milieu. This agonism with the external world will eventually take shape as vitalism's counterpart, mechanism. But before mechanism, the living human being has an attitude toward life that Canguilhem glosses as, quote, the ruse of reason. The phrase is from Hegel, but Canguilhem is also playing with the sense of stratagem present in the Greek word that he uses, mechanē, as we'll see further. Suffice to say here that mechanism as a scientific method and as a philosophy is already implicit in some way in the human use of tools. So basically the idea here is that the human is constituted by this fundamental push and pull. Channeling the Czech biologist Emanuel Radl, Canguilhem argues that man has two possible relationships to nature, either a child of nature or nature is treated as a foreign, indefinable object. So what we can see is that the vitality of vitalism in history is secured by a polarized definition of the human being in relationship to nature, kinship, or mastery. It's the polarity of human nature that will go on to produce the permanent oscillation of biological theory. This means that vitalism's vitality ultimately points to the irrepressibility of life's faith in itself. But nevertheless, this faith comes to be mediated in human beings by historically situated forms of vitalism. And as I've already said, the first of these is given as Greek. So we might say that life for Canguilhem latches onto history in the guise of vitalism through Greek names, Hippocrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Galen. Now, in truth, the nature of historical emergence as it takes shape in the essay is more complicated. And reflects Canguilhem as a historian. Although Hippocrates is the first to be named in the essay, Canguilhem introduces him in the context of a vitalist tradition that's already defined by the 18th century vitalism associated with the medical school in Montpellier. And the guiding principle of this tradition is the Hippocratic principle of vis medicatrix naturae. For Canguilhem, the principle represents the biology of physicians who are distrustful of the power of technique over life. So by introducing Hippocrates via an 18th century spirit of Hippocratism, Canguilhem perversely frames it initially as a reaction to mechanism, but mechanism as Cartesianism. Yet the appeal to a vis medicatrix naturae has a Hippocratic source, as Canguilhem would know well. The 4th century BCE text, Epidemic 6, has a discussion of untaught nature that was taken up by Galen in the 2nd century CE as foundational for a Hippocratic philosophy of nature. In the passage, the text runs, the body's nature is the physician in disease. Nature finds the way for itself, not from thought. So we can see that Hippocratic vitalism in the corpus, the Hippocratic corpus, can get behind Cartesian mechanism to claim historical priority. But what kind of priority should we accord ancient vitalism if it is by definition already a translation of something else, namely life's faith in itself? Another way of putting this would be to ask what mechanism motivates this translation so far removed from the Cartesian moment. In fact, the problem that I'm raising is already there in Canguilhem's invocation of Plato, Aristotle, and Galen as examples of the vitalist attitude toward nature that Radal had defined. But in Radal's theory, there are only 2 timeless options. Canguilhem, on the other hand, frames these sympathetic attitudes of Plato, Aristotle, and Galen as already vitalist, already inside a science of life. So this means that their vitalism has already been shaped by the prior emergence of the machine or technique as an obstacle to life. So it's worth emphasizing again that for Canguilhem, all life is agonistic vis-a-vis its milieu, and all life is creative in its strategies for survival. This means that the use of technology is, quote, a universal biological phenomenon, as he writes in Machine and Organism. So fundamentally, technology is not opposed to life. Rather, it's an extension of life into the milieu. For human beings, tools and machines are the expression of this extension of life. At the same time, it's in human use of tools that we find the seeds of mechanism. And here's where I would argue that Canguilhem's double translation of the Greek word mechane as machine and ruse shows its own cunning. So in a basic sense, the mechane is always double-sided. On the one hand, as a machine or a tool, it's an extension of human life into the milieu. On the other hand, as a ruse, it represents a disposition towards its object, toward nature, as a foreign, hostile thing to be hunted, captured, and controlled, precisely because nature is framed as the source of obstacles to life or a life. But this double-sided quality of the mechane is doubled yet again in Canguilhem's choice of the Greek lexeme, which he actually writes in Greek letters. He doesn't transliterate it. And he goes on to ally it with the figure of Ulysses. With mechane, we also capture a relationship that is at once permanent, that is part of what life is, but also historical. What I mean is that the Greek of the lexeme and the appeal to Ulysses signals the historical potential of the dialectic between man and nature held within the Greek term mechane. And this is crucial because it's only within a historical process by which nature is objectified as an object of control that vitalism can express the opposing sentiment, namely that man is one with nature. So in this way, the mechane enables the transition from the universal nature of man into the history of science on the quasi-mythic terrain of ancient Greece. And I think it's really of interest here that Canguilhem does not explicitly locate the Greeks within a historical process here. Rather, Ulysses and the mechane hover in this space of mythic time on the cusp of the transformation of life into vitalism. So in this sense, they stand behind vitalism proper. And this is especially interesting because when we turn to the second aspect of vitalism, we do find the Greeks actually invoked in historical terms through Canguilhem's critique of 18th century vitalism's return to antiquity. So this second aspect of vitalism is what Canguilhem calls its fecundity. And by this term, he wants to ask whether vitalism is productive within the history of biology, or whether it's an obstacle to scientific progress that biology should discard if it's going to make real discoveries. After all, vitalism could be vital, but it could also be sterile. It could persist not because it's rooted in some truth about life, but because it's an especially tenacious and pernicious illusion. At the start of the essay, Canguilhem had set aside questions of truth. But he now shifts back into the mode of historical epistemology in this second part to reframe the question of vitalism's vitality in terms of Bachelard's epistemological frontier. So what he asks is vitalism, its vitality, only a symptom of mechanisms' historically contingent limits? And if that were true, then vitalism would merely mark the ever-shrinking territory that mechanism has yet to conquer. And in fact, he's just anticipating the view we often hear that technology has already domesticated life, and mechanism has won in a way. But we could ask, would Canguilhem have ceded vitalism's ground today? And the answer is probably not. So he takes different tacks in responding to the charge that vitalism is a scientific dead end. He first lists the contributions of vitalists to the history of biology, but he quickly runs into the problem that these scientific vitalists are always producing concepts to explain what they're doing that look Greek, enteleki or horme. Canguilhem writes, quote, vitalism's fecundity appears at first glance to be all the more contestable in that it always presents itself as a return to antiquity, whether one considers the return to Aristotle against Descartes and von Helmont, or in the Montpellier Vitalists, or in the return of even Renaissance humanists to the Plato of the Timaeus over an Aristotle thought to have been overly rationalized in medieval scholasticism. Faced with this incessant return to antiquity, Canguilhem changes course. His new strategy is pivots on a split in modern, that is 18th century and contemporary vitalism, post-18th century vitalism. So on one side of the split, we're going to find what Canguilhem calls somewhat confusingly classical vitalism, by which he means the 18th century vitalists. And on the other is his own vitalism. And he elucidates this split, his break from 18th century vitalism, by differentiating two ways of returning to the Greeks. So this return, Canguilhem argues, doesn't have to be about revalorizing concepts that are worn out. Rather, it could be a return to the sources fueled by a nostalgia for intuitions ontologically more original and closer to their object. So what are these intuitions? It's not vitalism itself this time around. Rather, the intuitions that Canguilhem is interested in pertain to a dialectic within the science of life as it is played out in historical time, already in antiquity. So this time around, Canguilhem proposes mechanism as a philosophical position that already was historically realized in 5th century Greece, not mythic, but historically realized. So here, Aristotle's vitalism responds to Democritus's mechanism. Plato's finalism responds to Anaxagoras' mechanism. Canguilhem here spells out what he had only hinted at earlier. Insofar as the first named vitalists are Greek, they're responding to the emergence of historical mechanists like Democritus and Anaxagoras. But I would argue that they emerge in a space that was already opened up by a mythic mechane in the discussion of vitalism's first aspect. Now, Canguilhem's decision to name Greek mechanists at this point turns out to be critical for his own definition of vitalism. For his aim here is to take his distance from what he calls the Vitalist Eye. And so this idea of the Vitalist Eye is an 18th century, is a product of 18th century vitalism. And what it does is it offers a very naive vision, Canguilhem thinks, of the ancient Hippocratic past as pre-technological and pre-logical, a vision of life anterior to tools and language, that is, to instruments created by man to extend and consolidate life. We might say as a refuge in a way. Canguilhem wants to see, in contrast, both the history of ancient vitalism and life itself differently. So I think we can make better sense now of Canguilhem's earlier conflation of Hippocrates and the principle of vis medicatrix naturae. From my perspective as a historian of ancient Greek medicine, this conflation that he makes doesn't make a lot of sense. The defense of medicine as a techne is a guiding thread of the writings in the Hippocratic corpus, and this principle of untaught nature appears late in 4th century in the writings of the Hippocratic corpus. So you could make an argument using Canguilhem's own notion of a dialectic within biological theory that the principle of untaught nature responds to dominant strains of technological optimism in 5th and 4th century BC medical writing. I actually buy that story. Which is probably why I'm so worried about Canguilhem. But Canguilhem doesn't locate Hippocratic vitalism inside Hippocratic medicine. And that's because throughout the essay, he's really using the name of Hippocrates differently. as an emic expression of classical French vitalism, 18th century French vitalism. And he does this even as he recognizes that this emic expression is in fact an effect of the reception of Hippocrates in the Hippocratism of the Montpellier vitalists. So this is where things get really kind of entangled. In other words, though, what I want you to take away is that Canguilhem is here using Hippocrates strategically to name the 18th century vitalist refusal to cede any ground to mechanism. It's because the so-called Hippocratic spirit believes nature has no need of technique that it can produce the naive vision of pre-technological man. So in negotiating the apparent obsolescence of vitalism, Canguilhem appropriates Hippocrates to designate both the refusal to acknowledge the entanglement of life and technique and a false origin for later vitalists. These vitalists, the 18th century vitalists, are mistakenly using Hippocrates to prove the possibility of medicine before or without technique. And his counterposition is that vitalism and mechanism go hand in hand already in classical antiquity. So the wrong kind of vitalist return to antiquity is implicated in the 18th century vitalist misunderstanding of the relationship between life and technique. And so Canguilhem has to correct both aspects of the error. When he looks to the relationship between Democritus and Aristotle as offering the philosopher clarity on the problem of vitalism, his antiquity looks somewhat different. It's not viewed from within the classical 18th century perspective, which posits Hippocrates as a pure pre-technological figure. Rather, Canguilhem is adopting the perspective of a different vitalism, still oriented towards classical Greece. So what does this look like? So his own vitalism takes shape at the end of this section in his defense of vitalism's fecundity, which requires the outright rejection of 18th century vitalism. Discussing Bichat, he identifies this vitalism's philosophically inexcusable fault as its designation of an empire within an empire, that's Spinoza's Imperium and Imperio, in order to secure biological life against the laws of physics. Far from erring in its ambitions, he thinks, classical vitalism, 18th century vitalism, is too modest. And the argument here draws on the philosophy of the organism that is developed further in the lectures that follow aspects and in normal and pathological. So the strategy that Canguilhem adopts is to nest vitalism within to nest mechanism within vitalism. To live is to radiate, he argues. It is to organize the milieu from and around a center of reference, which itself cannot be referred to without losing its original meaning. The very behavior of man as technician and scientist therefore demands an explanation that privileges life. In this way, he claims a priority for life vis-a-vis mechanism that is at once logical and now historical. In place of the 18th century vitalist's naive vision of pre-technological man, he offers a vision of man whose use of tools and ultimately concepts is rooted in life as much as a vitalist resistance to technique. But of course, vitalism, even in its variance, is a translation of life's faith in itself, enmeshed in the analogous mechanist translation of a more fundamental mechane. And as such, it falls back into history, and history takes us back to Greek origins. The role of the ancients as offering historical priority with its glittering promise of originality and purity returns powerfully in Canguilhem's explication of the third and last aspect of vitalism, its honesty. Oops. So Canguilhem's defense of the honesty of vitalism shows him grappling with the most damning charge against vitalism, namely the charge that it's politically reactionary or even more toxic, complicit in the horrors of the Holocaust through the Nazi appropriation of vitalist biology for racist biopolitics. These charges were not abstract to Canguilhem, who fought in the French resistance, and it's worth remembering that the lectures date to 1946-47. But he refuses to accept the charge against vitalism on the grounds that politics borrows from biology, he says, what it has already lent it. The blame for Nazi biologists lies with the moral and philosophical failures of Nazi biologists, not vitalism. But Canguilhem doesn't leave things there. He works to free vitalism from blame by pointing to the innocence of its origins. He writes, if we look for vitalism's meaning in its origins and for its purity at the sources, we will not be tempted to reproach Hippocrates or the Renaissance humanists for the dishonesty of their vitalism. So why does he feel compelled to make this move? He concedes that you could give an explanation of the resurgence of vitalism in the 20th century in basically in terms of historical materialism, that is, as a crisis of capitalism within bourgeois society. And that would be a powerful reading today as well. But Canguilhem generally is impatient with externalist explanation. So he sets aside historical materialism in order to return to the space of Greek antiquity, where history transmutes into an expression of life itself, and indeed an expression of life's resistance to technique. The rebirths of vitalism, he writes, translate, perhaps in discontinuous fashion, life's permanent distrust of the mechanization of life. But the nostalgic longing for the purity of vitalism sources is itself implicated in a different kind of history in which the Greeks represent and have represented an innocent origin. History in the mode of nostalgic myth-making feels decidedly impure in light of another ism that became complicit in the formation of Nazi ideology, namely German Philhellenism in its attachment to a lost Greek homeland. So did politics borrow from Philhellenism what it had already lent it? Has the love of the Greeks ever been innocent? Surely not. So if we need a critical vitalism, can we pursue this end without also thinking critically about the Greeks and about Canguilhem's Greeks? By this point, I hope to have demonstrated how thoroughly the Greeks permeate Canguilhem's reading of vitalism as historical and philosophical in aspects of vitalism. There they are in every aspect of vitalism: vitality, fecundity, honesty. I've tried to show how on Canguilhem's account, the Greeks produced the first historical articulation of vitalism. Hippocratism is thus the form in which life asserts itself and keeps asserting itself within the repeatedly renegotiated terms of life science. But the Hippocratic vitalism of the 18th century also failed to comprehend the dialectic between vitalism and mechanism out of which it was created. This ancient dialectic, Canguilhem argues, can and must therefore be read in terms of his own vitalism, which repairs vitalism's ancient history in order to repair its philosophy. Within Canguilhem's terms, the oscillation between vitalism and mechanism in biological theory is part of a much longer, continuous, and indeed non-human story of life's exercise of technique. But it's also the result of a critical rupture in the relationship of human knowledge, of human life to knowledge. Canguilhem's own theory encompasses the philosophical position that life distrusts mechanization, even as it uses tools to evade obstacles. But it also encompasses the historical position that once Greek vitalism emerges, it becomes the template for life's knowing, conscious rebellion against science that's retraced in vitalism's rebirths and is a purer template. And here I think the political economy reading of vitalism in the 20th century does still pertain to some of the kind of dirtiness of vitalism in the 20th century. And that's why he has to go back to the Greeks. So Greece thus mediates between history and philosophy in the essay, and it enables Canguilhem to hold a philosophical argument about the relationship of life to knowledge and history. So it's impossible to grapple with the entwinement of history and philosophy in Canguilhem's vitalism without also thinking about how he approaches the history of philosophy in ancient Greece. At the same time, to be fair, Canguilhem isn't exactly doing the history of philosophy in aspects of vitalism. So he's not going to document the philosophical debate between Democritus and Aristotle. Rather, he surgically deploys that debate as a historical fact against the naive vitalist view of history in the service of his own philosophy of life. He can do this because he takes for granted the place of classical Greece as the spatio-temporal zone where life crosses into history as the object of both mechanistic control and vitalist care. By attending to the function of the Greeks in aspects, we can see that the essay is at a fundamental level addressed to the question of what it means to historicize this thing called life in relationship to technique. It's worth recalling the warped temporality created by Canguilhem's introduction of Hippocrates via the Montpellier vitalists. The blurring between Hippocrates and the Hippocratic spirit implies that Canguilhem is well aware that his ancients are mediated by post-Cartesian vitalism as it flourished in France in the 18th and early 19th centuries, even as he reads the Latin vis medicatrix naturae as the Greek of Hippocrates. He's committed as a historian to the view that organismic time is irreversible. But still, I would argue that the essay won't allow the Greeks to be contained within this modern reception. If they're imbricated in Canguilhem's history of the present, to borrow a term of Foucault's, it's precisely because they exceed modernity. What exceeds the 18th century reception is something like the life that fuels Canguilhem's own vitalism. Philosophy and history are mixed up because the Greeks are inside and outside of history. So in the last couple of pages, I want to just try to be more precise and show some of the puzzles I find myself with. We could take up ancient Greek vitalism and its reception from a historicist perspective. The history of the life sciences has been shaped by various returns to Hippocrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Galen. The Greeks are recursively and agonistically articulated through textual transmission and scenes of experimentation situated in institutions like state-sponsored translation movements, medical faculties, and commercial laboratories. As a historicist, I'd emphasize the messy density of the thickening of commentary and debate and interpretation around Greek texts. I'd stress contingency, that the history of life has many currents, that things may have always been otherwise, in defiance of Whig history, the teleology of Western progress, and proprietary claims on the Greeks by ancestors exercised by the figure of vitalist return. But I have to admit that Canguilhem's trans-historical account of vitalism refuses the complexity of thick history. The essay appears in the philosophy section of Knowledge of Life, not the history section. Why aspects belongs in the section on philosophy presumably has, I think, something to do with what it means to be working as a historian and a philosopher of life within a milieu. What I mean by this is that Canguilhem sees himself within a tradition of philosophical biology. He knows as a historian that this tradition informs his organization of the world and his understanding of his own experience. But this tradition doesn't just offer life to him as an object of knowledge. It offers a choice of what he calls an orientation mechanism or vitalism. And not just as a philosopher, but as a living human being, Canguilhem thinks he has a responsibility to decide between these two options, even as he creatively reinterprets what that decision entails. It is this space of choice or orientation towards, I suggest, that Canguilhem is trying to hold open when he describes vitalism as an ethics. Ethics means that being alive always entails the organization of the world in terms of values. And from this perspective, vitalism, he thinks, is choice-worthy in the world that has been shaped by its historical emergence. So could we read Canguilhem's return to the Greeks in the same spirit? Canguilhem seems to assume that to be vitalist is to go back to the Greeks. And that return is part of what secures the vitality of vitalism itself as over and above modernity. But at the start of my paper, I framed this assumption as a choice. Are the Greeks a necessary part of the history of life as an object of knowledge, of a vitalist history? And that question, as we saw, implies others. Are the Greeks relevant to what we call modernity or its biopolitics? Are they relevant to work of orienting towards life, away from the biopolitical, however it is understood? One thing I've tried to do in this paper is to give us a place to stop and assess Canguilhem's conflation of Hellenism and vitalism. One problem with the conflation is it reinforces the figuration of the Greeks as the origin of all science and philosophy. That problem is familiar, but I point more specifically to how the origin function of the Greeks in Canguilhem enacts the idea that prior to the birth of philosophy in Greece, man only had technique, understood as the most primitive form of mechanism. So this is the idea that Greece is where man first thinks himself. Another problem arises from a different direction, from the very elision of Hellenism in modern genealogies of the biopolitical that draw a sharp line between obsolescent ancient views on life and a modern science of life. What these genealogies have too often overlooked is the persistent function of the Greeks to figure the life that escapes modernity, the fuller life that is at once lost and able to be regained. So I would say a critical vitalism means thinking critically about the surplus of life the Greeks have systematically made available to modernity, regularly working with the savage, the primitive, and other highly racialized non-Western others to figure a vitality lost to us Europeans. So the choice here is not so much between ancients and moderns because of these entanglements, but between what kinds of stories we tell about Greek antiquity and life. And in grappling with this choice, perhaps we could think about Canguilhem's strategy to capture mechanism with vitalism. Remember that Canguilhem's revised vitalism mechanism is not only the hypertrophy of a technique that begins as an extension of life. Life and technique are inseparable. So let's ask, is there an analogy with ancients and moderns? That to the extent the ancient Greeks set some of the terms within which the moderns make their choices about life and politics, they're always already determining the way we moderns orient toward life and technology. We'd make our choices, the argument would go, within the terms of the life that precedes them and shapes their choices, even when the choice is to affirm modernity. And I think there is some conceptual force in this analogy. We can talk more about it. I've sort of sketched it here, but I'm actually going to reject it because I think it troubles me. And it troubles me that for reasons that I think extend more broadly to Canguilhem's organicism as it manifests as historiographical method. For it produces a falsely organic unity within biological theory as a history of life. In extending vitalism back to the Greeks, Canguilhem insists that each manifestation of it belongs to the same life. Admittedly, the life that Canguilhem has in mind is not the unity of Aristotelian holism, where the parts are always part of the larger whole. It's true that Canguilhem's organicism is different. But nevertheless, even if we read the history of a philosophy of life through Canguilhem's organicism, we've still imposed the unity of a life on that history, suggesting a coherence, boundedness, and interdetermination that reifies the Western tradition. So let me end by suggesting that we work instead through the organicism of Canguilhem's history of a philosophy of life by thinking of the ancient Greeks not as an origin point from which a life has unfolded, but as themselves part of the milieu. At a minimum, this might be a way to resist the recurrence of the Greeks in the philosophy of life science as an index of life itself. And it would be to resist, too, the definition of the Greeks as the moment where man takes life as an object of systematic knowledge and practice. Instead, it would be to attend to the very materiality of ancient Greek texts about life and nature and body and soul and readings and rereadings as part of the world inhabited by later thinkers wrestling with the question of human flourishing. These texts, in other words, would be part of a milieu inhabited by a loose collective of thinkers whose boundaries are always uncertain. Now, part of the challenge here would be to navigate between reading the Greeks as inextricable from the milieu on the one hand, and on the other hand, is framing any return to the Greeks as a choice on the order of choosing vitalism. We can talk more about that. It's a compressed version of a problem that I think is important. Let me just put it another way, though, and I'm almost done, is that Hellenism is woven together with vitalism to the extent that we can't choose to undo their historical entwinement. But getting clearer about how they work together might help us make choices about how we engage with vitalism, the Greeks, and the problems posed by life as part of a project of flourishing at a particular historical moment. And so here's where I think Canguilhem's philosophical historical take on vitalism asks us to think about the impossibility of neutrality in a landscape that's not of our own making, but is nevertheless remade, however incrementally, by our choices of which paths to value and why. Much more could be said about genealogies and method, about forms of elective affinity, but I'll close with Foucault and a response to a question posed to him in an interview conducted toward the end of his life. He was asked whether he thought that by turning to ancient Greco-Roman texts in his history of the hermeneutics of the self, he was seeking an attractive and plausible alternative to the present. Foucault strongly rejects that idea. Instead, he insists that his engagement with the Greeks had to be read within a genealogy of problems that remains actively attuned to how to define those problems now. My position, he says, leads not to apathy, but to a hyper and pessimistic activism. I think that the ethico-political choice we have to make every day is to determine which is the main danger. The Greeks and Canguilhem's aspects of vitalism function as at once historically consequential texts, myths, and objects of elective affinity. By diagnosing the different facets of their role in the essay, I've aimed to make a little clearer how reading the history and philosophy of vitalism through the Greeks is always an ethical political choice made in a particular milieu and at a particular moment. Thank you so much for your patience, and that's it.
Thank you so much, Brooke, for that fantastic paper. And I have to second what Tristan said at the beginning, that it exemplifies exactly what we're trying to do in our network, not just simply to look to the Greeks and the Romans for support in a critique of modernity, but to also in turn critique our actions in undertaking that turn to the Greeks and the Romans as well. And of course, not letting the Greeks and the Romans off the hook in the process. What we normally do is we assign a sort of 10 or 15 minutes to question time. And if anyone would like to ask a question, they can type the letter Q in the chat, and then I will throw to you, and Brooke can have a chance to respond. Does anybody have any questions? Tristan, you're usually good for a question off the bat.
I do have one developing in the background, but I can see that Charles Stocking has asked.
Certainly. Okay, Charles, I think you got in there just ahead of my throw to Tristan. So please ask your question, or anybody who would like to ask a question too can type their question, and I'll read it out if they prefer not to speak on Zoom.
Thanks so much. I didn't mean to jump the gun there, Tristan. Sorry about that. But thanks so much, Brooke. Really fantastic paper. I had, and I've been thinking a lot about these things too, obviously, and I really loved your point about this problem of techne, obviously, and the medical texts in particular, but also the philosophic texts. And, just the basic facts from your work on Phusis, the fact that Phusis is called the demiurgos, right, the craftsman, already conflates this issue. And there's a way in which I think maybe we could think about mythology and, or for lack of a better term, archaic Greek thought as an alternative to positing philosophy and medicine as origins, right, to sort of undermine and question those origins, because of course philosophy and medicine are reacting to and responding to these earlier stages. So I guess, I do have a question. I wanted to add one thing that I think could really work in this issue with vitalism, a little piece of philology. If we agree with Pierre Chantrain, then the verb to give birth, tiktain, is related to tekton, the craftsman, as well. It's the same Indo-European root, right? So literally it's the craft of birth, which I think really explodes that division, that desire to make the division between nature and techne, which is obviously not there in the classical world. So I guess my question is, if the reception of the Greeks is always wishing to push nature preceding technology, which seems to be the case, and that doesn't seem to be accurate to the texts themselves, when does this happen, right? That's sort of my question there, is to think when and how does nature take priority over techne if that's not the case in the ancient world?
Thank you, Charles. There's so much packed in there, and your tiktain etymology is making me think, there's a whole dimension of this that is about, that I'm seeing Emma and Sarah, and I'm thinking I could just hand it over to them, like all of a sudden trying to process, the ways in which the figuration of the maternal as the site of fusion of reproduction and production, and Malina too, and just trying to think about the ways in which the demiurge as a kind of father figure is dependent on, that form of maternity that's taken out of actual bodies. So there seems to be a lot, I think, embedded in that, and that's not in Canguilhem at all, but that would be crucial to kind of thinking through this question in the Greek material. And then I'll come at, the second part of the question, which really does, maybe we start to distinguish, we say, okay, look, like, this is my problem. I work on this stuff and I'm really interested in the Greek material. And so it's important to me to distinguish what this is, which is not the beginning of capital N man, right? That this is a parochialized site for a tradition that's nevertheless very, very diasporic and long-lived. And then this is the other part of it, that at some level shapes our, I think everybody on this call's ontology at some basic level. And so that's where I think the Canguilhem vitalism stuff raises really powerful questions about, it's never just about history, right? Because of the limits on how much we can deterritorialize our thought, to think of Eduardo Viveros de Castro. But to go back to so I have to make that clear, because you asked me a question about when does this happen historically. And so the challenge that I'm trying to work with Phusis is, So I guess I would answer that in two ways. I mean, one would be that I do think, and I alluded to it, that the untaught nature stuff is a reaction to technique and is a reaction to the production of the body as a site of fluid dynamism that needs to be disciplined by mind, by the doctor, by the technician. And I don't want to conflate those things too much, because I think one thing that's interesting about Canguilhem is that he's interested in medicine because it is a site of technique, not just as rational control, but material control of bodies. So for him, technique has that very strong material consequence. And I think that's true of the Greek material. So I do think that, medicine is the techne in the 5th century. If we're going to start looking at that period, it makes physis the object of control and knowledge. And then you start to see this movement whereby physis is also the site of its own agency, which is very different from the agency of, say, the liquid humors that we see, in the 5th century, but also continuing to recur throughout the tradition. So part of my story that I would want to say about physis would be I'll just say two things so I don't go on and only talk about this. One would be that it's really important to me that it's diachronic. So I really want to resist the kind of notion of physis born from the head of Athena in, Odyssey book 11 or whatever, and then that's it. That's the Greek has invented nature, or even that they invented in the 5th century. So a lot of the work of the book I'm working on now is about a diachronic development of the idea of nature in conjunction with thinking about vitalism and thinking about the projection of the unified vitalist body onto the cosmos as a whole. And that is a work that happens over many centuries and happens as Greek philosophy becomes a commodity in the Hellenistic and Roman worlds and is being appropriated by and is in dialogue with Babylonian philosophy, with Egyptian philosophy, with Roman philosophy. So that's, to me, part of the work of nature going that direction. But I also think, one of the things that seems obvious, but when you really just kind of sit with Canguilhem again, is you forget how easy this is, of course, I think you can say that Greeks do create this concept of physis that creates its own momentum. We don't have to find physis in the Babylonians to make them philosophical. But they're, of course, they're not just man with technique before thinking philosophy. So that's what I'm trying to do too, is separate the question from what it means to have systems of thought and knowledge, and Francesca Rockberg's work has been really important here, in the Babylonian context, from the question of having nature as an object of knowledge. And what does that do to attempts to control the non-human world in the appropriation of nature?
That's awesome. Great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks, Charles.
Lots to talk about.
Yeah, sorry, it was kind of scattered.
I believe Jacques Lezerat, you have a question.
Hi, Brooke.
Hi, Jacques.
Lovely to see you.
Nice to see you.
So the question sounds as though it's being answered by your next book. So this is perhaps an invitation to give an even sharper précis of that. I heard you use two phrases that I think might be of interest. One of them was the Greek materials, and the other one was the Greeks. Those are differently technologizable concepts. The Greeks is a historical formation that gets deployed and instrumentalized and becomes part of the curriculum in one way. Greek materials suggests much greater diversity and a philological kind of granularity and a dispersion that doesn't lend itself in the same way to instrumentalization. And I was wondering whether, to your concluding question about the separation or the relation between vitalism and Hellenism, one should ask the question of whether we need to start asking about the undoing of the concept of the Greeks, and or at least the historicization, the constant rehistoricization of the concept of the Greeks, and perhaps its replacement with the notion of a much more philologized notion of Greek materials, with a much more historical precision concerning what they were used for, at what times, by whom, which materials, to what purposes, under what conditions, and so forth.
Thank you. That's a really great point. And I think, my first thought was, I absolutely agree. And I think that you're right that in the book that I'm working on now, I'm grappling in a way that I, wasn't prepared for, because I hadn't worked in the Hellenistic and Roman period, but I've been mucking around with it for a while now. But like the ways in which Hellenism, becomes a commodity, becomes a language, here I am writing about Stoics and Chaldeans, and, most of the Stoics in question come from, Roman Syria and Babylon. And, there's a whole world that opens up around Greek as a language of power, Greek philosophy as a site of cultural capital, and then the movement to basically, respond to that position of Greek philosophy by, on the one hand, making what I would call ontologies of relation, or accounts of, what we might call a cosmology, but I'm really interested in systems of relationality, which is why I'm so interested in sympathy. Seeing this as nature because of the power of Hellenism, but then also the move which Greeks and Romans, Greek speakers and Roman speakers participate in, to make the Persians, or to make the Babylonians, or to make the Egyptians older than the Greeks too, right? So that a Greek philosophy of nature is actually just the recasting of knowledge that was older in Greek terms. So there's a whole operation that's happening that's forcing me to think about this in ways that is incredibly important for all the reasons that you outlined. And I think it's become a really crucial part of what it means to talk about the history of nature as quote unquote Greek, in ways that I hadn't anticipated, but that I'm sure, you see, right? And the only reservation I have, or the kind of part of me that came back, was to say, I do talk about the Greeks sometimes, and I talk about the ancients. And the reason I do is because I think that and this is where I'm sympathetic to Canguilhem, is, no pun intended, but like, I think he's on to something about the conflation of history and philosophy that's irresolvable. And I think in the philosophy side of it, when you talk about the Greeks, that's a site of elective affinity. It's a site of imagining yourself in conversation with thinkers. Now one should, maybe the kind of way forward be to say, the Greeks become this vastly diasporic community of people, all around the ancient Mediterranean, and the Greco-Arabic, translation movement, and, Ravenna, wherever, that this is this huge, in India, like huge expanded world of the Greeks. That may be the way to take this step forward. But I guess where I would hold on to that notion is in a sense of trying to be clear-eyed about the forms of attachment and the forms of affect and value judgments that we make about why we study this material in the first place. And I think that those questions can never be answered exhaustively by historical reasons. They always terminate in value questions. And so it's important to me to keep the value, like, there's no innocence, like there's just there's none.
Good, thank you. Yes, I subscribe.
Thank you.
Tristan, you get your turn now.
Yeah, thanks. And just to say that I absolutely agree, the importance of value in value questions is so important there. Okay, so my question is basically about the concept of flourishing, which appears at the end of your abstract and at the end of your talk today. I'm kind of guessing that you think flourishing is also between history and philosophy, as is vitalism. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what exactly this flourishing is as you use it. It's kind of become the favored translation of Aristotle's, eudaimonia, since about, I think, the 80s or early 90s. And I wondered whether you could situate the way you're using flourishing within both the reception of Aristotle, eudaimonia in Aristotle, but then also the way the flourishing might have been mobilized in other broader philosophical discussions today.
That's a great question, Tristan. I mean, so you're right that I use it as what I think is a very good translation of both eudaimonia or arete, as the thing that, you know, Greek ethical physical philosophy gets invested in. And I suppose part of it is another take on, you know, I'm going to talk myself into a bit of a hole here, which is, you know, I don't think Zoe and Bios have this split. I do think physis has an internal split around what is given and what you, in the Hellenistic philosophers, you know, physis can also be living according to nature in a state of flourishing. And the Stoics, you know, so in Aristotle, I mean, I was just going back to Julianus's nice, you know, in Morality of Happiness, and it was helping me because I taught a class on nature, and I don't think I really realized the extent to which Aristotle, you know, in the theorization of natural slavery, you know, physis does, you know, humans act like other, you know, inanimate objects or something. Like physis is aligned with what they just become, right? Like what he doesn't want ethics to be driven by physis in the same way. Physis opens up a possibility, but the realization of that possibility is not through physis directly, right? Like, because that would be too automatic. And the Stoics try to close the gap here. And I see Emma has a question, and she can give a better version of that. But the Stoics do try to close that gap around nature. And I think that, you know, flourishing is where they're trying to imagine not the givenness of your implication in the sympathetic network, right? Like that, you know, to live a life within a deterministic cosmos that nevertheless makes ethical sense. So this is a long way of saying I'm invested in the idea as something that I find philosophically interesting. But in answering your question, I'm wondering, you know, in a sense, it's like, is it just reintroducing ideas of vitalism or ideas of, you know, bios or something like that all over again? And I think, you know, that would be a fair critique. I mean, the reason that I'm so interested in these critiques in drilling down is because I think we can't avoid the problem of life, and I would like to live it well. And so the question becomes, you know, I would like others to live it well. I would like to build a world where people flourish. So, you know, how do we engage that commitment? Honestly, well, part of it is doing the critical work of trying to be clear about what kinds of stories we're going to tell. And so you ask a good point, because I think flourishing requires the same kind of critical work.
Back to value, right?
Yeah, I mean, let me optimistically frame it as what I might use when one finishes the critique, you know, but first the critique is ongoing.
We have a question from Emanuela.
Hi, yes, thank you. Thanks, Brooke, for a really fantastic paper. I really appreciate this. I have a maybe more traditional philosophical question to maybe, you know, because you're taking such a kind of, you know, amazingly kind of historical approach in some ways. So I want to pose a philosophical question that's also a clarification question, because I'm not, I just want to get clear on some of these things. So I don't know the Canguilhem essay. I'm just going to admit that up front. And I really want to read it now and see what's going on with that, because that sounds fascinating. But it seems to me that one of the stakes in both the Greek concept of physis and in vitalism is the question of the separation of matter and movement. And I guess I want to kind of hear what, you know, I mean, you can think of vitalism as a movement in which that is those two things are kind of conjoined, or those two things are kind of separate. You know, there are different ways of conceiving or critiquing vitalism according to that split. So first of all, I guess I'm wondering where you see Canguilhem falling on that, and then I guess I want to ask the question about Greek physis, because of course, you know, that is at the heart of Heidegger's reclamation of the notion of physis, that it he wants to argue that, you know, there's a version of it in which there is contra a more traditional reading of Aristotle, that there is no split between matter and motion in the Greek notion of physis, right? That's kind of Heidegger's move, in a sense. So I guess I'm just sort of, I just want to sort of use that optic of that split to try and sort of see, just ask you what you think about that connection. And then further to that, the reason that these questions are so on my mind right now is because there was a paper earlier today at the Ancient Philosophy Society conference. I've been in Zoom all day, so excuse me if I'm a little incoherent and zoomed out at 10:30 at night. But there was a paper on Fusis, Heidegger, and Irigaray, and one of the questions, there was a kind of a raising of this kind of materialist point that's been argued by a Japanese philosopher, Karatani, about isonomia versus democracy in ancient Greece, and arguing, and I don't, this is like secondhand, I don't know this work. I haven't read this book, but it sounds, I feel like I need to run and read this book immediately. It's called Isonomia and the Origins of Philosophy by Kojin Karatani. And in this book, he apparently argues that in Ionia, the social organization, the political organization, in contrast to classical Athens, is that of isonomia versus democracy, and there isn't the same split, but where the material, the productive activity in the society is relegated to the slaves. It's more evenly, apparently. I mean, I also don't know a lot about Greek social organization in Ionia, but it's apparently in this isonomia model more consistently spread through the social body than in Athenian democracy. So apparently, that argument is to say that, the kind of ideas of Fusis that are coming out of Ionia are going to be more integrated in terms of this split between matter and movement than they end up being in classical Athens. So, I mean, that's just another thing to sort of throw into the to consider as a kind of, I don't know, as a possible way to go with this idea of a kind of more historicist or materialist analysis behind that you seem to be pushing towards. So yeah, an incoherent end of the night question, and I hope it makes some kind of sense.
Yeah, I think it does, but I'm going to ask you for a little bit of, just to make sure that I understand the nub of the matter motion question. I mean, in this sense of self-moved matter, in that sense, vitalism is marking something with soul, something that's capable of moving itself, versus matter that is subject to movement by others. Or
yeah, I mean, I think that's my question to you, because go
ahead.
Yeah. Because one of the ways that vitalism gets critiqued, at least a certain sort of Bergson version of vitalism, is that there's this kind of there's this idea of the substance that is separate, a metaphysical substance that is, the elan vital or whatever, that is separable from matter.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I see.
Right.
Yeah, I see. Because I think that's where Canguilhem is responding precisely to that version of vitalism. So that's his response to classical vitalism. That's his rejection of the, imperium and imperio, that there would be some separable domain, which is, called life, which is outside the mechanistic laws of physics. And that's the nub of his move in the second section on the fecundity of vitalism, is to say, I'm going to invert the story and actually embed mechanism, the laws of physics, within vitalism, insofar as mechanism is always being used by a living being in order to negotiate their own flourishing in the world, which, there is a kind of Aristotelian quality to this. I mean, like a kind of what I would call an oikological orientation, that like everything is focalized through the living being who then uses tools, and that's the way that he, as it were, sort of subsumes physics into biology, as opposed to biology being this island, special island inside physics. So he does reject that, but I suppose that, you know, you could push back and say there's some emergentist account here that has to nevertheless produce the living agent who then can swallow up mechanism in that way, right? Like, it doesn't come at the problem from where life separates itself out from its milieu, you know, but it comes at it from another direction. But that strategy is very, very important to his reclamation of the Greeks as already expressions of a dialectical entanglement of life and technique, and his rejection of the Greeks as sort of naive vitalists, as it were. So that's how Canguilhem would come at it. So I understand, you know, that question, although I don't know Bergson as well as you do, or Heidegger for that matter. But, you know, I think that from coming at the question, you know, from the ancient material, you know, I think a lot of this question of vitalism in antiquity, like, is that a term that you can use? You know, is there a philosophy of nature or life? Like, I think there is something that poses the same philosophical problem. And I think that what happens is, from a historicist perspective, some of it is the question of soul and self-motion. But some of it, or at least this is what I'm struggling with, is some of it has to do with the elevation of life as unified. And so there becomes like fixation on unity as the, you know, the way to solve heterogeneity, you know, lack of organization, everything comes down to unity. And you can see this, I think, in the Stoics, but perversely, I think you can even see it in the Epicureans. And that's where the sympatheia as the condition of life becomes really important, because it enables the shared life of parts within a whole capable of acting as a total agent. So one of the interesting things about Hellenistic philosophy, but coming out of Aristotle in some way, is the attempt to understand agency through unity and understand, you know, that specificity. Of course, the problem the Stoics then come up with is that they've blown the living being up to the size of the cosmos, and which Aristotle won't do, I think, because it then creates unified living beings, including humans, as parts of a larger whole. And that's where they struggle with their theories of ethical agency and determinism and reconciling the two. So I think from a historical perspective, that's kind of where that goes. I don't know if that answers the question, but I mean, I think it's the heart, the nub of a lot of the concern about sympatheia in the medicine and philosophy is the emergence of the question of how you unify the multiple parts. You know, and Aristotle's obsessed with this question, like, how do we hold together all the different parts and the constant exchange of flux and, you know, and unity? It becomes really so important to enabling that persistence in time and the execution of agency. I don't know if that goes in if that helps at all.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. I mean, I guess I was kind of hoping to kind of push you further a little bit back into kind of pre-Socratics, but you know, actually that's incredibly helpful to think about.
I mean, maybe I'll just say, like, part of the reason I don't go back to the pre-Socratics is I'm quite invested in this idea that these questions are creatively worked out over centuries outside of the classical Greek, you know, setting. So, like, I'm less interested in going back to Ionia, and I'll read Caratines, but like, there's a part of me that's like, no, there's no place where, you know, I hope there were places, ancient societies without enslavement. Like, I think that, you know, Athenian democracy and Athenian philosophy, we can see the ways in which enslavement and the anxiety about freedom is just, you know, shaping their entire metaphysics in many ways, at least in Aristotle. I hope there are places where that's, you know, not happening. Maybe they become other sites, but I am suspicious of single sites that produce, you know, through their kind of political utopia, produce metaphysics that we can appropriate. So there's a kind of gut reaction I have where I'm much more interested in the kind of hive mind of a tradition, diasporically moving, and philosophical problems that just densify problems and generate interesting ideas to take up, but don't generate answers in the same way.
I'm just gonna put this book in the chat because it just seemed very exciting to me anyway, because, you know, we need more. But I don't think it's a utopian project. but I really appreciate your suspicion around that as well. So yeah, that's great.
There's actually a good review of that book in the Marx and Philosophy Review website. So if you're interested, it's reviewed rather nicely there. That's marxandphilosophy.org under the book reviews section.
There's also a related, probably relevant book by Karatani, which the name of it escapes me. But basically tries to reread historical materialism through modes of exchange, and he goes back to Greek antiquity amongst other societies as well.
I just have one, and I realise that we are sort of pushing time, and it's late in the evening over there, and so we're going to release you very, very, very shortly. But I'm curious about mechanism and about the assumptions about the interior life, in quote marks, of the technical object. I know that Canguilhem is contemporary with Guy Simondon, who wrote a wonderful book called On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, and perhaps also was involved in teaching Baudrillard too, who talks a lot about operationalization of life as well. And I'm just sort of interested in the way that we assume that the Greeks, as you say, were kind of had this naive pre-technological kind of idea, but in actual fact, it looks like a lot of the critique of technology and modernity goes back to a kind of much more subtle understanding of what technological objects are in early Greek thought. Particularly, I'm thinking about, what Vernon has to say about really early understandings of technology. So, for instance, in Homer, the telekinesis and so on, and the kind of the magico-religious nature of technology. But perhaps that's for another time. I think, but I'm just thinking that, that this dialectic between vitalism and mechanism can also be fruitfully kind of looked at from the point of view of mechanism as well, and from technaire.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'll just say, this is another reason why I'm so sensitive and interested in Canguilhem, is because I very much share that critique of, the Greeks, right, as pre-technological or pre-modern. And part of the story that I want to contest of the history of nature is precisely this idea that first we have vitalism, and then we have, Cartesianism or the technological, and then we do, something else, modern biology. I think atomism in some ways is, there's, good work on, we can't conflate atomism as such a mechanism, but I think Sylvia Berryman's book is good in looking again at some of the later, once you get in Hellenistic period, there is a lot of mechanistic thinking that is producing, in Galen, Galen is in some ways a vitalist precisely because he's responding to fairly developed notions of mechanism. And so it's really important to me that this dynamism is embedded in the tradition before Descartes, and that Descartes is just a point that we point, I'm not saying modernity is not important, but we fixate on these moments as if, they just cut the history in half. And I think that produces, bad philosophy.
Anyway, I just like to thank you again, Brooke, for sharing such wonderful criticisms and insights with us in our little network, and to thank everybody for joining us across the world at ungodly hours. And also, I'd just like to take this opportunity at the end of semester one, and at the end of our first tranche of papers to thank my colleague Tristan Bradshaw, who has really done the lion's share of the work in setting the network up and the workshop up properly, while I've been slaving away with undergraduate teaching. So thanks, Tristan, for all of your help in making this actually happen, and bringing it to in with such fantastic guests. But thanks again, Brooke, and thanks again to everybody for attending. Have a wonderful morning / afternoon / evening, and we'll see you in semester two. So stay tuned for an update on our semester two offerings to be produced shortly.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thanks
so
a lot.
much.
Thanks, Brooke.
Thanks everyone. Bye.